Good evening. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson, co-host Gene Hislop, and with us Heidi Rankin, who is going to talk with us about women's issues. Heidi, first of all, let me have you introduce yourself to the audience, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Again, my name is Heidi Rankin, and I am the Prevention, Education, and Community Outreach Coordinator at the Women's Center that's located near the library in Danbury.
Tell us more about that. What is prevention education?
Well, that's a pretty exciting field right now. So at the Women's Center, we do offer frontline services, primarily around relationships. So a focus on domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, stalking, and life changes. So it's called resource services, and that could be issues around employment, that could be issues around divorce and separation. We have support groups and counseling. And everything is free, and everything is confidential. So it's a great community resource. So there's frontline services, and then I work in the education department, and that is where our efforts are going to try to end the violence before it begins.
Now, is this focusing more on school age, or are you also doing community outreach for other, organizations and such mainly, like, for instance, religious institutions, or is it mainly just focused in schools?
No, it crosses, it's actually the entire lifespan. So we actually start with children who are in preschool.
Oh, wow.
To start to talk about identifying feelings, boundaries, bullying, safe touch and unsafe touch, and then literally go through the lifespan all the way to talk about elder abuse and everything in the middle. So through the school systems, in the community, reaching as many people as possible, because this issue, from a prevention perspective, is one of the community and coming together to work together to end the violence. This isn't all about the Women's Center being the only ones working on this issue. It's really talking about what can we as a community do to end relationship violence.
I hear family values all through this.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's great. Now, you mentioned briefly about how you approach young children about this, and to put things in conceptually so they can understand it. But all right, I'm a 5-year-old. Tell me kind of how you would approach me differently than you would my mom or my dad or my teenage brother.
Well, everything we do is age appropriate and really is all theory based. So it would have elements of child development. Where are children in their development, and therefore what kind of messaging is appropriate for them. What we're trying to do is build resiliency and protective factors in kids so that they are less vulnerable to become victims or perpetrators. So that's a goal. So with really little ones, we use puppets. We do puppet shows, and the puppets really talk about these issues, interact a lot with the kids. Volunteers at the Women's Center make little paper puppets that then the kids can take home, because we've tried to give them some skills on some things that they can do. So they practice.
They truly can do their own homework and practice and further understand and bounce it off the wall, if you will, of their own room, and get a sense of how that relates to their own personal experience.
That's right, and best practice means that we're also doing education and training with child care providers and teachers and parents and anyone who might be able to support that child to keep that kind of infusion going, to keep those skills really active. And then as the kids move older, we may use stories, we may use role plays, all of the above, small group work, activities to start to get the kids to really be dealing with these issues as they grow older, and the things that they face may start to look a little different.
Now, the bullying aspect of what you said is quite interesting, because that's obviously a very timely issue. I mean, a lot of states are enacting statewide anti-bullying legislation. First of all, I don't know, does Connecticut have statewide anti-bullying?
There is legislation in schools. have to have policies in place in order to deal with bullying, which is a positive thing, because what that means is the schools are responsible to have some sort of response to bullying. And in fact, this year, in the legislative policy advocacy kind of work that we do on a state level, we are all the member agencies in Connecticut are asking to have dating violence be placed similarly in policies so that schools again have a mandate to respond to it, because right now it's a huge issue, but right now there is no mandate in the school to have to deal with it.
I mean, you have usually per school. I mean, when I was in high school, I mean, I'm sure they've got a little more staff dedicated to it. But when I was going through high school, you had your 2 guidance counselors, or maybe 3, for the school, and then you had a social worker that was there, and that was it.
That's
right. The
teachers
teachers were not equipped to deal with this at all.
Right.
So, are they addressing that on a larger level, having more? Workers there for the kids and stuff on an ongoing basis
Well,
these
the
days?
good news is that last year, in terms of legislation, something very positive happened in that now all school districts have to, on their PD days, their professional development days, they now are obligated to offer a workshop on domestic violence and what children living with domestic violence bring to school, and also one on dating violence, and those have to be offerings for their professional development days. That's a very positive
absolutely
thing, and so we spend a fair amount of time with teachers looking at that, and have not, all Connecticut teachers are not trained yet, but there is a consistent effort led by the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence to have a statewide, consistent teacher training curricula that can be used across the state.
Now, are people who are victims of bullying in their younger years usually prone to be in abusive relationships as adults? I mean, is there a correlation?
It depends.
Between that?
It's something where we don't like necessarily to make a direct correlation, and there's certainly not a causation there. But what we know is that these can be kids, counter to what the understanding has been before. These kids used to be seen as the kids doing the bullying behavior, and we say that so as not to label kids. If kids are labeled as a bully in 1st grade, what are they when they're in 9th grade? They're a bully, right? They can never shed that once they are labeled. So we're careful with language around that. But what they used to believe is that these kids had very low self-esteem, and that this was their way of gaining some power so that they could build themselves up. And in fact, the research now shows that kids who use bullying behaviors have quite high self-esteem. And it's a sense of entitlement, and they exhibit it by having some kind of power over someone else. They like it. They get a lot of positive feedback from their peers.
So they might wind up growing into narcissistic personality types as adults.
Very possible, absolutely. So these kinds of building resiliency and protective factors so that kids don't need to be exhibiting these behaviors is one very important step. And then intervention is really important. And the movement really is building on a sort of bystander intervention is a very strong component now of where the whole movement is going, so that the culture will change.
And victims of bullying, though, obviously, because that's such a destroying thing to a child's self-esteem, it's such an incredible, painful thing for people to carry for so many years. And I know that often people who are abused in, like, say, childhood or a relationship when they're young, they will often wind up, and I mean, it seems to be a cycle for them too of falling into, abusive situations and such. So is there also a similar correlation where you're seeing children who are bullied then often become victims of abusive relationships as adults?
It can be, and that can be because we know that low self-esteem is a huge issue in terms of being able to assert for a healthy relationship. And so that can also be a problem. And some kids who are victims of bullying become bullies.
I'm glad to hear. I'm very glad to hear that there is hope, that even though, of course, there's maybe a greater likelihood that kids that are bullies will continue to carry that on and move on to more difficult behaviors. I'm glad to hear that there's hope that intervention can break them away from that cycle. So that, as you mentioned, the kid that's the bully in the first grade doesn't necessarily have to be the kid that's a bully in the second grade.
That's right.
And eventually those titles and those perceptions of that kid can wear away, and they can be viewed in a much more positive light.
That's right.
You know, ever since that the Trevor Project started, you know, I've wanted to do one of those "it does get better," you know, type episodes, because I will tell you that, you know, the bullying experiences that what I went through as a child, and I'm not saying that I didn't struggle as an adult too. I've certainly gone through my relationship issues and such, but I was bullied when I was a kid. And you know what? At least 3 people who I'd gone through school with and who were bullies have come up to me now as adults. They found me on Facebook and they said, "I'm so sorry. You know, I'm so sorry for the things that I did to you." So somewhere along the line, they were able to get that message. So, you know, I don't know where in life it happened. Maybe taking psychology courses in high school or college, or maybe their children. You know, they have identified, "I am so sorry that I did that to you." You know, and so there is hope that people can realize what they've done and the damage they've done and turn around their lives.
That's right. We did a wonderful program with middle school girls because the girls, 8th grade girls, excuse me, identified the issue of, you know, girl to girl kinds of mean behaviors and bullying, as well as sexual harassment. And they went to the vice principal and said, "This is, you know, really, really terrible, and we want to do something about it." And so we went in and worked with them. And one of the very powerful experiences that we had was that the girls had a piece of paper. And on one side, so we did, let me back up a moment just to say that we use actors at times. My coworker, Kelly Mullins, is the director, and she has local professional actors, many at WestCon in the theater department, who do interactive theater. Very, very powerful tool. So in this case, we had actors who, all girl actors, and they played out some scenes. The girls in the audience were able to interact with them and challenge them on they stayed in character, challenge them on their behaviors, and we're able to say, well, you know, why would you do that? Why do you think that's okay to treat friends that way?
What does girl-on-girl sexual harassment look like? You know, the mean girl syndrome and sexual harassment. You know, because
it's usually around language and could be texting or any kind of online things talking about
a woman's character, a young woman's character,
how she dresses, how she acts,
who she went out with,
and what maybe she did, and so it's alive and well in middle school. You know, rampant. I would actually go so far as to say.
Perhaps even more likely to escalate quicker when you've got the added dimension of texting or sexting and Facebook and then those other communications.
Absolutely, it can go so fast.
And it's hard. And it's hard for any kid that gets himself into a situation where they're behaving badly towards somebody else. It's hard to walk out of that. Once it's out there, and it's very hard right away or within a reasonable time. Unlike your situation, where years later people came back and said, "I'm sorry that, you know, I bullied you. I apologize." You want that to happen quicker, and it's much less likely to happen quickly when you've got the multimedia aspect of it, probably.
Yes. And the kids believe they're, most often they believe they're anonymous.
Yes.
They're in the safety of their bedroom, and they're doing this, and so they take risks that they would not take if they were sitting next to you. The way, you know, when we were children, perhaps, and we were bullied at recess or something, it was face to face.
Right.
That is, you know, that happens, but there's so often a component of online.
Yeah.
Now bullies. Is it possible that the bullies are also at the same time being bullied, not just within the family, outside of school, but even a pecking order right within the school where kids, this one picks on that one, who turns around and picks on that one, and they all kind of get into this quagmire of bullying. Does that happen?
That's possible. We hear less about that. Does not mean that that's not things that are happening, but one of the things that might be happening as well is that kids are being bullied at home.
Yes.
You'll never amount to anything. Why can't you get grades like so and so?
By a parent, or even by an older brother or sister.
Right. Right. You're never, you're never going to amount to anything. All those kinds of messages, again, so that that's the kind of behavior that they experience. Isn't that how people treat each other? That's my experience at home. And then if I play it out at school, I may get some power out of that. And certainly at home, the bully is getting some power.
Right.
Yes.
And some gratification.
And domestic, and just domestic abuse, we realize the same cycles, that if somebody is being abused at home, they're more likely to become an abuser or a victim of abuse. So, obviously there's all these cyclical connections, which is what the Women's Center is trying to work on. In addition to the outreach to youth and schools, I love the Women's Center. I love what they do. But for our public that might not know, what other aspects of outreach and help does the Women's Center provide for people?
Well, let me make sure that I mention some of the important things. So I mentioned support groups, self-esteem support groups, divorce support groups for kids. So a wonderful, still just a couple years old, where children of divorce can come and be with their age group, and at the same time, one of the parents comes and is part of a parent support group. So it's a very comprehensive kind of experience that's really very popular. So those kinds of things are going on. We put on workshops. Things, and particularly in this kind of financial climate, workshops around media literacy, around even food, how to prepare nutritious meals on small budgets, things around parenting. So whatever the sort of the community is really kind of asking for is something that that we do our best to provide. And another very important thing is that we do a lot of referrals, meaning that after 35 years in the community, if we don't do it, we know who does.
Right.
And so we have comprehensive resource listings so that if someone should call and they have an issue, they often have phone calls are often multiple issues, as makes a lot of sense. But so there may be questions about housing, there may be questions about food stamps, and they also may be dealing with an unhealthy relationship and are looking for some counseling. Maybe their child is looking for some counseling, because we also have a child advocate who works with children. Maybe they need shelter. Maybe they are living and need to flee from a physically abusive relationship and they need safe shelter, which we also can provide. So it's very comprehensive. And I like to think about it being on a spectrum. So there's all the frontline services for victims and survivors and their families. Because what we know is that those people around sexual assault or domestic violence are what we call secondary victims.
Yes.
If anyone we know, love, or have a relationship with is a victim of any of these, we are impacted as well, and we sometimes call that secondary trauma. And so it's not unusual for family or friends or neighbors or someone to come in and also do some counseling about how they're feeling about.
If a mother was unaware that her husband had been molesting her child. Imagine the level of trauma that she goes through.
Absolutely, and maybe siblings and extended family. So
everybody, I imagine everybody kind of knows about it to some degree and has to deal with their role in it. They're being in the middle of it.
Right.
And again, I'm hearing family values all the way through this, and that's something that really cuts across the entire political spectrum. We all believe in family values and the importance of helping families cope and to better themselves and to get to be more than just survivors.
Absolutely, absolutely. We hope they move from survivors to thrivers.
Yes. And what are some of the bills in legislation that you could talk about that have to do with domestic abuse, with women's rights and such, to help make them, into thrivers?
Well, one thing that's been very positive is that we're in the second year of the Domestic Violence Task Force, which is now, we weren't sure if it would go beyond the first year, but it actually has, and it has been very successful and very instrumental in really raising the visibility of these issues for all to see. So it's there as a priority. They meet, they look at legislation, they have public hearings. And so last year, as I told you, there was some legislation around teacher training, setting up some additional domestic violence court dockets in some communities, some things like that. This year, some of the things that are being looked at is continued 24/7 funding for shelters across the state, because there was an infusion for that last year, and we're concerned that that might go away. That's a huge issue because it means that the shelter does not have a counselor on staff necessarily from 5 o'clock at night until 9 o'clock in the morning or on weekends. And it's not a big stretch to think about how often a client needs to access those services between 5 o'clock at night and 9 in the morning.
That might be prime
Or
time
on the
for
weekends.
needing to talk about something.
That's right. And that's often a time when if clients who are at Elizabeth House are beginning to have doubts, or they're alone at night with their kids or something, and they have no one there to offer support. So that's important kind of support. So we continue to advocate to continue that funding this year, and in perpetuity is what we would like as well. There's also legislation looking at extending the statute of limitations on child sexual assault for minors, so in civil courts. So up till now, it's I think it's now 45 or 48. And after that, you cannot sue someone for that. Well, this is a problem on many
48
levels.
years
old
between the crime.
No, 48 years old.
Oh, so if you're older than 48,
Right,
you've
so
given
as a
up.
minor.
The victim, the one who does the deed, or both?
The victim.
Victim. Okay.
Yes, the victim. And what they're saying is for many reasons, someone may not disclose until after that. Either because they've blocked the memory, and then the memory over time has come back,
or there's been other family members
or
involved.
something has come up, someone else has identified, and then the person realizes that they have, or they've never decided to report. They're well aware, but they've never decided to report. But when others do, they feel more empowered.
And sometimes it winds up being, I've heard many stories of this. They didn't report the crime because they didn't want their mother to be brokenhearted. They didn't want their grandma to be brokenhearted. They didn't want their aunt, so they wait until those people have passed on before finally being empowered enough to tell their story.
Right. That's right. And it's very traumatic, So this person now at whatever age,
silence,
absolutely.
For the benefit of someone else that you don't want to draw into the conflict.
That's right. So our hope is that legislation will pass, so that there will be no statute of limitations around that. Trying to think of some of the other things on tap. I told you that about the 27. There was one other thing. If I think about it, I'm going to bring it back up, because there's a few things very early on cooking, and every center has legislative liaisons, and so I am one for the Women's Center and 2 co-workers, and what that means is that we are really tasked with spending time with our legislators, talking about how these pieces of legislation would impact as often as possible if we have a client or someone who may be able to testify as to how this would have helped, how their experience and how this fits in, the need and all of that, then we often do testimony.
So stricter penalties for people who have perpetrated sexual violence, is that something that your organization has advocated for or testified, regarding? And I was thinking about this because of the home invasion case in Cheshire, where the woman and her 2 children were murdered and sexually assaulted before that.
Right.
Obviously that was a hugely upsetting case. I mean, and so do you get into the legislating for stiffer penalties as well for perpetrators?
Sometimes I don't believe that that's been sort of on the legislative list in the last while, but one of the things that's important, and that is an issue that the community is not always aware of, is the very public cases around horrific sexual assaults are ones that we get pretty familiar with, and we're all horrified. We can imagine, someone we know. I mean, it's almost impossible to even think about it. But what we know in the work that we do is that 85% of sexual assaults are committed by someone you know.
Right.
And that's an important piece to have out there, because we tend to, when our kids are growing up, particularly our girls, we tend to talk to them a lot about having, a plan, a safety plan. Don't walk alone in the dark. Don't park your car in the parking garage. Someone that, might jump out of the bushes.
Check your back seat before you get in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We could name them all. We could fill this room with all of those. And those are all important things. But if that's my only concern, if that's the only time that my sort of antenna are up, is if I'm, worried about strangers. 85% of the time, that's not the danger. The danger is someone crossing my boundaries, manipulating me, perhaps, plying me with alcohol or drugs or whatever in order to manipulate for sex.
Absolutely.
It sounds like the focus is more on, you mentioned about the case in Cheshire, but it sounds like the focus is more on preventative, focusing on the victims rather than making things better for them, and leave the justice part of it up to the justice system.
Well, we have a vested interest in a healthy justice system, that is for sure. Adequate protective and restraining orders, in order to try and keep someone safe. But what we know in terms of prevention is actually we need to have a stronger focus on pre-perpetration and not such a big focus.
Okay, we're going to come back and do a second show. This has been Progressive Soup. David Stevenson, Jean Hislop, and
Heidi Rankin.
All right, we'll be right back. The miracle of television.
So we'll